Hi everyone, welcome to Science Talk, the third episode of our season. My name is Johan and I would be your host tonight. I've been hosting this series this fall. And as you know, I will give a short intro and then we will have the speaker for the evening. So the idea of tonight is to have a talk from an expert, and we started the series with the 4 research chairs from U of V. Then we have the second and third series with, we've continued with other scientists from the University of the Fraser Valley. We've had a few of the research centers scientists as well that have almost all shared, but I've also got a lot of emails with a list of other scientists and researchers from U of V that would be interested to share. So I'm sure we'll have other series and I'm already looking forward to it. And the program, so we'll have a talk from an expert and then we'll have a Q&A. And as you know, you can just leave all your questions in the chat. And yeah, the event is being recorded and we will share it afterwards on YouTube. And we have a sort of a community agreement at Science Talk, and the idea is to kind of frame the conversation of every science cafes. And it's to say that it's a conversation with an expert, and it's not a debate. And there is obviously a different level here when we hear from the expert and from me and probably other people here as more of a lay audience. But we want to welcome a wide variety of questions, and we encourage equal participation. We promote curiosity, discussion, inclusion, and generosity. So make sure to ask your tough questions as well in the chat. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, and first and foremost, the University of the Fraser Valley, who has helped us with speakers, and also to promote the event, and also with financial resources as well. And the project started from a small neighborhood grant from the Abbotsford Community Foundation. And then we decided to keep going with other events. And we'd like to thank TEDx Abbotsford Connects, the U of V alumni, and Vision Financial and the City of Abbotsford for their ongoing support. And tonight, to present the speaker, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gary Fair. He's the Associate Vice President at the University of the Fraser Valley, and he will introduce the speaker. Hi, Gary, are you here with us tonight?
Yes, thank you, Johan.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Yeah, I really appreciate being able to listen to the different science talks that we've had. And again, it gives me pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, which is Dr. Sandra Gillespie. After completing her PhD at the University of Massachusetts, she worked as a postdoc at both the University of California, Davis and Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on pollination ecology with an eye to understanding both basic and applied aspects of pollination. The widespread use of managed bumblebee colonies in agriculture is now recognized as a potential disease vector among pollinators. Her previous research has documented high prevalence of pathogens and parasites in East Coast wild bumblebees. She has worked on improving our understanding of the severe range contractions and the drastic declines of many previously common bumblebee species in North America. So within the Fraser Valley, bumblebees are of key importance as pollinators of high bush blueberry crops that are worth about $125 million. Wild bumblebees are important pollinators for some varieties of this crop. So while efforts are underway to develop new managed bumblebee species for use in this system, Dr. Gillespie's research aims to demonstrate how pollinator abundance and health will be key to maintaining the populations of wild pollinators. So as a faculty member in the Department of Biology at UFV, Dr. Gillespie is working with students to study the diversity and health of both local bumblebee populations and other wild pollinators. Dr. Gillespie, I'm looking forward to hearing you present Beyond the Honeybee, an introduction to native pollinators and their threats.
There we go, that's my sound. Hi there. Share the screen. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Okay. Whoops. How's that look? We good? I think we're good. Someone tell me if
Perfect.
it's not.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
It's perfect.
Always have to check. You never know. Some sort of random Zoom problem is known to happen. All right, so thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm super excited to speak to you all tonight about thinking beyond the honeybee, to think about the different kinds of bees that might be important. I'm just going to hide that. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so let's get started. Here we go. Lots of pictures today. So let's start with this question. We talk about bees. Well, what is a pollinator? And a pollinator isn't just a honeybee. A pollinator can be anything that visits a flower, gets that pollen on its body, and moves those gametes to another flower so that it can set seed. And these are just some examples of different things that can be pollinators. Some of them are bees. You'll see there's a beetle in there. There's a butterfly. We actually have a really fun species of fly here that mimics a bumblebee, but is also a pollinator, and birds, bats, and even sometimes rodents can be pollinators as well, right? So it's just anything that will visit a flower and help that plant make some seeds. And of course, as Gary mentioned in his introduction, pollinators are important. And they do this thing, they provide these things called ecosystem services, which is something that the natural environment does for us that provides a service that is useful, right? And these are important in both wild ecosystems and what we call agroecosystems, so agriculture. And these are some old numbers, but the estimate is that the yields of up to a third of the world's crops are increased by pollination, by wild pollinators and managed pollinators. And bee pollination in total is valued at 15 billion yearly. And that number's probably gone up. And they're also very important in natural ecosystems, which we also rely on for a whole bunch of things. And if we didn't have pollinators, we would still have food, because many of the sort of big crops we rely on are wind pollinated, like rice, like wheat. But our diet would be pretty bland because we would lose all of these wonderful fruits and vegetables that rely on pollination. Now, most folks, when they think of pollinators, and when I say I study pollinators, they go, oh, the honeybee, honeybees are in trouble. And there's nothing wrong with the honeybee. Here's the humble honeybee is the major commercial pollinator worldwide, because it's easily produced in large numbers and they're remarkably portable. A single worker can produce a hive of up to 80,000 or more workers. And because of this and their sort of portability, we have this thing called migratory beekeeping, where honeybee hives are packed onto big trucks by the hundreds and thousands, and they're moved all over North America, particularly to California, to pollinate these big orchards of almond trees. Now, back in 2006, around when I started my PhD, the questions I got about bees shifted from, oh, you study bees? I've been stung by a bee once, to, oh my gosh, the bees are in trouble. Aren't they collapsing? Is it because of the cell phone towers? If anyone remembers that. And this was because of this thing called colony collapse disorder, where hives were dwindling over the winter, bees were disappearing, and there were real concerns about whether we would have sufficient stocks of honeybees to pollinate crops. And so this global worry over honeybee stocks and honeybee health brought pollination and bees into people's consciousness, and wild pollinators kind of came along by association, because wild pollinators are also in trouble. And I like to point out to people early on that honeybees are not native to North America, right? So if you're thinking about helping the bees or protecting the bees, if you're going to keep honeybees in your yard, that's kind of like having chickens to save the songbirds. The chickens are great, they give you eggs. Honeybees are great, they pollinate food, they bring honey, they're fantastic, but they're not a conservation concern, right? They're an agricultural species. Here in North America, we have in Canada, just in Canada, we have 800 different species of wild bees. And in British Columbia, we have this incredible diversity of about 600 different types of bees that are visiting our native flowers, visiting our crops, and acting as pollinators. And they're very different. And so what I like to do really in these sorts of talks is tell you all a little bit about why they're different from honeybees, right? So they have these wildly different life cycles where instead of living in a hive, they might live in twigs, they might live underground, they might live for 1 year, as opposed to having these hives of thousands of individuals. And you can kind of think of the difference as being between annual versus perennial plants. So I kind of think of a honeybee as like a big oak tree or honeybee hive. You know, you've got the queen and the hive will grow and it will last for years and years and years. So it's like a long-lived perennial plant that will keep going out and pollinating and living for a long period of time. Wild bees, our native pollinators here in North America, are more like annual plants, like a marigold you would get in the spring and plant flower in the summer, and then it's done for the winter. And the whole diversity of native bees that we have here typically have this life cycle where they come out in the spring, and you'll the queen bumblebees in just a few months come out, and they're getting their nests started, and they'll raise their offspring over the summer. And by the end of the year, it's the new queens or the offspring that will overwinter. The rest of the hive will die, and they'll start again in the next spring. Right, so bumblebees get their own special slides because bumblebees are my thing. There's 50 species of bumblebees in North America. I think we have about 12 here in British Columbia. Well, Fraser Valley, there's technically 12, though I don't see them all. And they form colonies with a queen, much like honeybees do, right? So you have a queen come out in the spring, finds a nice place to nest, and they nest underground in old mouse burrows or other cavities. Folks I know have seen them in their birdhouses or their compost heaps sometimes. And the colony only lives 1 year. So you've got this queen, she rears these worker bees, and they help her rear new queens and males. And at the end of the summer, those new queens will go out and they'll mate with the males, and the queens will go overwinter. They'll find somewhere to overwinter, and everybody else dies. It's sort of dramatic. It's like an annual plant, right? You've got the seeds left from the end of the summer and the new queens, and everybody else is dead. And then the cycle continues in the next year. And they're what I would call generalist foragers, right? Bumblebees will opportunistically feed on pretty much anything, including flowers that are typically visited by hummingbirds, a bowl of sugar water you left on your patio, all kinds of things, right? So they're really important pollinators because they visit and pollinate such a great diversity of plants. And then my bee colleagues hate this a little bit, but here are the other bees. And so, you know, we've got 50 species of bumblebees and then hundreds and hundreds of species of these other bees. And they're extraordinarily diverse. They nest in a wide variety of habitats. They nest in the soil, they nest in woody stems, and they have all this great variation from what we would call a solitary bee, right? So solitary bees, you've got one female, like in my picture of the little digger bee up there. She digs a hole, makes a ball of pollen, raises a couple offspring, and that's it. Some of them form large aggregations or semi-social groups that aren't quite like a hive you see in a honeybee, but they're not really an individual bee either. And like bumblebees, they have this annual life cycle where it's the offspring, the egg or the pupa that's going to overwinter to the next year. And they have extraordinary variation in their foraging strategies and the kinds of foods that they eat. Some of them are specialists. This is in the top corner here. This is the squash bee, Pepinapis prunosa, that only feeds on squash flowers. Now, we don't see them up here, but they're really important pollinators of squash in California and in the United States elsewhere. Right, and so if you think we should save the bees, then the thing you have to ask is, what do bees need, right? And bees really need two things. They need a nesting habitat, right? They need a place to rear their young for the year, and they need food. And that food, of course, comes from flowers. But different kinds of bees need different kinds of things. And if you want to sort of support this great diversity of bees, you have to think about the diversity of things that they need. And I think one of the interesting ones to think about is nesting habitat. So different pollinators look for different kinds of nests. And we have these things called renters that look for pre-existing holes, which they will raise their offspring in. If anyone here likes to keep blue orchard bees, if you get the nesting boxes for them, they're a renter, right? They find holes in a tree or holes that you've drilled in a log or something, and they will come nest in those pre-existing holes. Bumblebees are also renters, that they want to find a mouse burrow that already exists and they'll go use it. And then we have excavators, and some excavators will dig holes in the ground. Other excavators are actually capable of digging holes in solid wood. Bees also need food, but it's just not any old flower, right? If you are a gardener, you might notice there are some flowers that never have bees and some flowers that are covered in bees in the summer. And that's because bees need the right type of flowers, the right type of food, good quality food, and what I call continuity of food. So that's food throughout their life cycle. When it comes to quantity, you have to think about two things. Bees rely on nectar, but they also need pollen, that stuff that makes you sneeze, right? And that's the carbohydrates and the protein that make up their diet. The nectar gives them energy for foraging and everything else they do. And the pollen that is the source of protein that they use to rear offspring. So if they don't have pollen, they can't make more bees, right? So it's key that they have access to both. And there are issues now with whether bees can get both in our habitats, right? So because some flowers provide both pollen and nectar, and they're great bee flowers, but some only provide one or the other. So on the one side here, I have a picture of one of my students from my postdoc at SFU in a field of Scotch broom, which is an invasive plant. It has pollen, but it doesn't really provide much nectar. And on the other side, I have a blueberry field. And similarly, blueberry provides pollen, but it doesn't actually provide some nectar, but not a lot. So the way that the landscape is changing might be changing the quantity or the types of foods that are available to bees. Now, quality is also important. And much like the things that we eat, not all pollen is created equal, and pollen itself can vary in protein content. So this is just a little graph here with % protein, and you can have pollen from some plants that is almost empty of protein and some that is extremely rich. And that pollen can also vary in the types of amino acids that it has, just like we have essential amino acids that we need to get from different types of food. So bees will specifically forage from a variety of plants to meet their nutritional needs. Right, so for example, blueberry pollen is actually pretty low in protein. So bees that are foraging on blueberry, and not just bumblebees, but even honeybees, will go out into the landscape and seek protein from other sources as well in order to meet the colony's needs. Okay, let's think about continuity. So bees need food throughout their lifespan, and different bees forage or search for food for different lengths of time. A bumblebee colony starts in the spring and grows bigger and bigger throughout the summer, and may even have its life cycle extend into early fall. Something like the blue orchard bee, which is in the family Osmia, comes out in the spring, lays its eggs, leaves the pollen for them, and is finished quite early. So depending on the types of plants that are flowering, those bees may or may not have food available at those times. So for example, blueberry flowers in the very early spring, so it's great flower that maybe Osmia would forage on, and it's there for the very early stages of bumblebee colony establishment. However, those bumblebees, they need food the rest of the year. So they need, within the landscape where they forage, they need other plants that are flowering and overlapping to create this sort of continuity of food that's available. And as landscapes become degraded or habitats become degraded, we might be losing plants that leave a food gap where perhaps for a period of the year, there's not enough food for that colony. And much like agricultural landscapes, landscapes that are really invaded by certain species may become food deserts for large parts of the year. So this is Himalayan blackberry. It is a pretty intense invasive plant that takes over lots of the landscape here in the Fraser Valley. And for the period when it flowers, it's a bonanza of food. Bees really like this plant, but once it's done, there's nothing, right? Because nothing else can grow where there's blackberry growing, right? So you have these basically food deserts, these places where there was a lot of food and now there's nothing, and the bees colony is kind of sitting here going, well, how do I feed my offspring? Okay, so these are maybe some ideas of the things that bees need, and maybe a little introduction to how this might lead into the challenges that wild bees are facing. And what we're seeing as we study these bees is that some populations are stable or even increasing across their range, while others are declining or they have even disappeared. Right, so the bottom picture is the yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus vosnesenskii. It's quite common here. You might see them in the spring. The queens are really big. They have this beautiful velvety texture. They're really lovely bees. And we're kind of at the northern end of their range, and they've been increasing in terms of the numbers of them that we see here. On the top slide is Bombus occidentalis, the white-tailed bumblebee. 20 years ago, it was the most common bee in blueberry fields here in the Fraser Valley. And I've never seen one. I've caught hundreds of bees in parks around the Fraser Valley for the past 4 years, and they just aren't here. They're not extinct. There's a few, I've seen them on Vancouver Island, a colleague's seen them up in the north, but they've undergone this sort of precipitous population decline that remains relatively unexplained. And all of these bees are facing challenges as they live in these human modified habitats. What do those challenges look like? Well, the first one, and really the biggest one for all wildlife, is loss of habitat. Here in the Fraser Valley, the conversion of the land to agriculture happened a long time ago, but there's this intensification and this conversion of land ongoing to housing, which is taking what might be wild habitat and turning it into human modified habitat. The second is what I call habitat degradation, which is where the habitat that the bees were using has become more hostile, less beneficial to the bees. And like bees will use agricultural landscapes quite happily. So a less intensely managed fields, cow pastures with lots of alfalfa are actually really great bee habitats. But as we intensify our agriculture and go to these sort of big monocultures of single plants that maybe only flower for a short period of time, or even crops that don't flower at all, we're slowly sort of chewing away at the habitat at the edges that we're maintaining those bees populations over time. And the other problem is the natural habitats that we do have are becoming degraded by things like invasive species. So this is a Garry Oak meadow on Vancouver Island, and the invasion of Scotch broom can take something that has this wonderful diversity of native flowers with lots of pollen and nectar and turn it into a monoculture of Scotch broom. And then the last thing I want to mention is this issue of pathogens and invasive species. And these are the things that I'm really studying. The first thing I want to mention is this bumblebee here, which you might have seen, you've probably seen. It's called Bombus impatiens. It's an eastern bumblebee. So it's native to the east coast of North America. And it's been domesticated, and it's in heavy use to pollinate greenhouse tomatoes here in the Fraser Valley and down into Washington. And though those greenhouses were meant to be screened, the inevitable has happened and it has escaped. It's become naturalized. It is reproducing out in the wild with the native bees. And a really big question right now is what the consequences will be, because what I'm seeing so far is that their populations are increasing and their populations are spreading. So will they spread pathogens to our native bees? Will they compete with them for resources? We actually just don't know. So this is something that critically needs to be studied, I think. I'd also point out that my data shows that bumblebees in the Fraser Valley actually have high pathogen infection rates. So I study this disease called Nausea bombi. It's a microsporidian, it's a fungal pathogen. And in my research in other places, it's 10%. And here it's 30% of bees that have it. And I'm not really entirely sure why. I'm collecting data over time to try to figure that out. But it's certainly something to be concerned about. All right. So the last thing I want to mention is people think, how can I help the bees? Well, have a honeybee hive. If you love honeybees, have a beehive, have your honey, but that's not helping the bees. So the other ways you can help, the biggest thing you can do is if you have property, you can plant a garden. Providing foraging resources, particularly resources that are available throughout the year, thinking about planting for spring flowers and late summer flowers and things like that, and planting bee-friendly plants, whatever those might look like, are a great way to support native bee populations wherever you live. You can also think about providing the other thing that bees need, which is nesting habitat. And I think a lot of people now are starting to put out these sort of, if you have especially fruit trees, putting out these nest blocks to encourage blue orchard bees. But other things you can do are to leave hollow twigs in your yard instead of cleaning them up. They're another place that bees will nest. Or if you happen to see an aggregation of bees in your lawn for living in the dirt, maybe don't freak out. They really don't sting that much or at all. They're very gentle, and just let them be. Okay. And the last thing I'll say, because most of us don't own property, is that you can support restoration habitats, right? Restoration of natural habitats. If you can't plant a garden, you can look at the park in your neighborhood and think about how to make it better. The greatest example of this is really what's happened in Victoria. There are groups of people that do this activity called broom bashing, and they go out and they coordinate with the local parks, and they remove Scotch broom. And efforts like that can actually take a habitat that looks like this and return it back to something like this, a diverse habitat with native plants that support the native pollinators. Okay, so just to wrap up, I like to point out that wild pollinators, I think they're diverse, they're fascinating. Take a closer look at what's visiting your flowers next summer. See if you spot things like this wonderful little osmia or these different native bumblebees. They vary in habitat and food requirements in ways that are quite different from maybe the honeybee and the beehive that you're used to thinking about. And I really think conservation efforts need to keep this in mind. So if we're going to do habitat restoration, can we plant different types of plants that will flower throughout the year and provide continuity of resources for pollinators, for example? And of course, if you can, plant a garden. Right, and on that note, I am happy to take questions.
Nice, thank you for this great presentation. We can maybe just stop your
Oh, sure. Go.
Your screen sharing, and everyone can share question in the chat. Feel free to put your question in the chat, and I would start with one maybe simple question.
Sure.
I've read online on the internet, so it must be true, but I think actually it's not true. There's some big conspiracy out there that says that Einstein supposedly says that if the bee disappeared, then humans will disappear.
No.
It wasn't from Einstein.
I don't think it was Einstein. I don't keep up on my random bee quotes on Facebook.
Okay.
I don't believe that was Einstein. He gets a lot attributed to him, and I don't think that was him. And I actually don't think it's true, because a lot of plants are wind pollinated. So if you lost bees, and when people say, oh, we lose the bees, they're thinking we're going to lose honeybees, but there's thousands and thousands of species of bees. It's unlikely that they're all going to go extinct. Some of them are actually quite adept at living in human modified habitats. But as you lose diversity, you lose pollination of the diversity of plants or efficiency of pollination and other things like that. And if you didn't have pollination of bees, well, for one thing, you could do it by hand. Go with a paintbrush. People do this for when you're breeding plants, but it would be a lot of work. Basically, our diet would be really boring. We'd eat a lot of rice. We'd eat a lot of wheat, which is wind pollinated. And then we'd be taking vitamins to make up the difference, right? Yeah.
So as a very anthropocentric question,
Sure.
we will survive if the bees will collapse.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
But
not,
then we will eat boring food.
It would eat boring food, and wild ecosystems, it would be extraordinarily depauperate of plant diversity. So you would lose all of your flowering plants.
Okay.
So it would not be a very nice world, but we'd certainly have food to eat.
And could there be since we also live in the digital age,
yeah,
could there be a digital or technological solution to replace the work of the bees?
Yeah, there's been attempts to make robots. It seems a bit silly when you have an organism that does it quite effectively for you. So I'm not sure that's a terribly good use of resources, but you could design bee robots, but they can't even design a robot that picks a strawberry as effectively as a human yet. So that might be a little ways away.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a good point. It'd be to replace it by some biotechnological solution where we have the natural solution right here. Interesting. And then, so questions are coming in. I'm gonna just read some of them. And one was just, I think, sent to me. First question, what effects do greenhouses have on wild bee population? So
the greenhouses, So I can tell you on the East Coast, because the Bombus impatiens is native there, the greenhouses aren't screened, which means that the bees go out and they forage on the plants next to the greenhouse with the wild bees. And there's really strong evidence that what happens at that point is what's called pathogen spillover, because these managed bees, they're growing in these dense places, they tend to have high rates of pathogen infection because they're given lots of food so they can kind of deal with it and then still grow. And so they go out and they spread those pathogens at flowers. So things like Nausea and other bee pathogens are transmitted at flowers, much like a doorknob might be where you'll pick up the common cold. So those greenhouses have these negative impacts on the neighboring bees via the spread of pathogens. Now, here in the Fraser Valley, because the bee they're using isn't native, the greenhouses are supposed to be screened. But I think half the time there's holes in the screens. The bees will chew holes in the screens if they really want to get out. And they really are going out and interacting with the wild bees. And of course, they're naturalized now anyways. So there's that effect. And then there's the sort of other effect that greenhouse agriculture is fantastic in a lot of ways. But once you screen in your ecosystem, those bees can't use it, right? So it's basically from the perspective of a wild bee, it's as good as a parking lot. There's no food that they can use, whereas a blueberry field, the wild bees can actually go and use that resource. So I'm not anti-greenhouse. I think they're great aspects of agriculture, but they do have that negative impact on wild bees for sure.
And I think this question might be related here. You mentioned that 30% of the bees in the Fraser Valley are infected with Nausea, whereas in most places it's less than 10%. And any idea why?
Yeah.
Why and how?
Yeah. So in Massachusetts, and this was a while ago, it was around 10%. Other places it's been higher, and I'm not entirely sure why. There's differences between different species in their ability to tolerate the pathogen. So you might see higher infection rates because the bees can survive and deal with it. So they're sick, but they can still survive. Whereas where bees might be more sensitive, they're going to die when they do get infected. So there might be interactions with the kinds of bees. There might be interactions with the landscape, with stresses due to different things going on in their environment that we actually don't really know. I don't know yet. I would like to know. It's on the list.
In the next research project.
It's one of the things I'm trying to figure out. My students have to finish dissecting my bees for me first.
Oh, nice. So we'll have to do a follow-up science talk. Yeah. And then a question from Mary O'Connell, who says, how do wasps interact or challenge bee colonies, and how do you tell the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should put that in a slide at the beginning, the difference between bees and wasps. So wasps don't collect pollen. They might forage for nectar, like they'll go to flowers, but because they don't collect pollen, they don't have adaptations for collecting pollen, which means they're not hairy. One of the big things you see on bees is that they have these things called branched hairs. They're super fuzzy. And those hairs aren't just to keep them warm. They're an adaptation to get pollen on their body. And then they have all these combs they use to get that pollen off and stick it in their baskets. So if it's smooth and yellow and black, it's probably a wasp. And if it's fuzzy and it's got pollen on it, it's probably a bee. My colleague at SFU also used to say that if you look at their faces, wasps actually look really mean. This is not terribly scientific, and bees are much cuter. So if it has a cute face and is collecting pollen, it's probably a bee. I don't know if that's,
So we can quote you on this, bees are much cuter.
They are cuter than wasps. Wasps are also really important. I'm not anti-wasp either. I have a whole thing I tell people about how important wasps are, but and they interact with bee colonies. So wasps will rob nectar or honey from honeybee colonies, I believe. I'm not a honeybee expert. And they might interact or challenge one another at flowers, but your typical like paper wasp that you're trying to get rid of on your back porch, they don't really interact that much because wasps are predators, and their prey are typically things like caterpillars and other things like that. So they don't typically eat bees. Yeah.
Thank you. And next question from Dr. Joanne McLean, president of UFV. Wonderful presentation, much appreciated. Can you comment on the possible effect of pesticides and other forms of pollution on bees and their work as pollinators?
It's a great question. It's not a simple question. So pesticides are by definition things that kill insects, right? That's what farmers use them for, which means that if they're interacting with pollinators, they're going to kill them. Farmers like blueberry farmers are very careful about that because they know they're growing plants where they need pollinators. But there are all kinds of issues about non-lethal effects and bioaccumulation in the soil that might be having these impacts on bee behavior in more subtle ways. And so I can't comment specifically on what might be happening here. Certainly these extra forms of stresses might contribute to population decline or things like pathogen infection rates. But that of course needs some more work. But yeah, it's definitely something that will negatively affect the bees when they encounter them.
Next question from Craig Toads, also from UV. Thank you for your presentation. We just experienced our first successful year with a large mason bee habitat.
Oh, that's great.
Any tips how to care for it and ensure the larvae survive next spring? When to take the habitat outside in the spring?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I am not a mason bee expert, but if you email me, I know someone from the Native Bee Society of BC who is, and they did a whole talk on mason bees last year. And I can probably dig that up for you because some folks are sort of taking mason bees to the next level beyond, I've put a habitat out and, maybe they live, maybe they don't, to really taking the larvae in and taking care of them in the winter so that you have really high survival rates and then bringing them back out. So Judd, I would email me and I will find that talk for you and get you information from an expert on mason bee husbandry. And
could you remind me what are mason bees?
Sure, mason bees, the scientific name is Osmia lignaria, or they're also called the blue orchard bee or bobs. They're actually not native to here, but I don't think they're really that much of an issue. They're a bee that specializes in foraging very early in the spring when fruit trees are flowering, like apple trees and cherry trees and plum trees. And because they come out so early, they're really great pollinators to have if you have a backyard fruit tree. And they're super easy to attract because they just need holes of the right size in wood. And so you can buy orchard bee nest boxes, or you can do what my dad does, which is drill a bunch of holes in a log, and hey, that works too. And they're really gentle. They don't sting. They're super fun for kids to watch. And of course, they're doing really great work in terms of pollinating your flowers. Yeah.
So we'll have to follow up on Craig's bee habitat as well.
Yes, please email me, Craig, and I will find that info for you because I do know an expert on that sort of backyard project.
And the next question from Olav Lien, former speaker of Science Talk. Hi, Olav. Such a great bee talk. How far can bees travel from the pollen sources to the plants they pollinate? Would flower garden planted in urban settings a few kilometers away from the crops be useful?
And that's a super great question. And the answer is it depends on the bee. So honeybees and bumblebees will forage up to 2 kilometers at the very edge of how far they'll go to get food. The smaller the bee is, the smaller that radius is. Right? And so bees are what you would call central place foragers, that you can think of like a dot in the middle where their nest is, and there's some range that they'll forage around that sort of central point. And bumblebees and honeybees quite far, kilometers even. Little tiny native bees, it might be a few hundred meters or 500 meters at most. So it depends on the bee, right? So for a bumblebee, they might be going to the bit of forest across Highway 1, 2 kilometers away, and they might be getting extra pollen that they need to supplement the sort of crappy blueberry pollen that they're feeding on. But if you're a little native bee, you can't do that. So you need if you want to support the full diversity of bees, you do need habitat kind of at a finer scale.
And then is there a good resource you can recommend that we can use to learn more about the various aspects of supporting bees in our yards?
Yeah, I always tell people to check out the Xerces Society. That's with an X. They're an American society, but they do a lot in insect conservation, and they have a whole bunch of resources on bee-friendly plants. And I know they have region-specific lists. They have a list for Washington. Do they have a Canadian chapter? They might do. So I would start with them because they do have nice region-specific resources. Honestly, one of the best things you can do is just see what the bees do, right? Plant a few different things and keep the stuff they like, and maybe try some other things that maybe you might have not thought to plant before. If you're interested in planting native plants, I can recommend the native roses are really fantastic bee flowers. They're not as pretty as a cultivated rose, but the pollen is just fantastic. The bees really love them. Snowberry is also a great one if you have a lot of space. Bumblebees are a big fan of that. But Xerces Society would be a good place to start.
And will bees use sap sucker holes in trees for food, or are they limited to flowers?
Mostly limited to flowers. There are bees that will collect resin from trees. They don't necessarily feed on it. They might feed on it. They might use it to build their nests. They might use it for basically pathogen and fungal control management. Resin collecting bees are more of a tropical phenomenon, though. We don't really have them up here.
All right, thanks. And keep asking questions. Don't hesitate to put it in the chat. And I have a few other questions for you.
Sure.
I was wondering what brought you to this field?
Oh, yeah. So I went to Simon Fraser University for my undergrad, and I knew I wanted to study biology. I come from a family of biologists. My dad's a retired entomologist. He worked for Agriculture Canada. And I went to university and I said, I'm not going to study insects because everybody around here knows my dad and I want to get away from that. And so I got really into plants. I started working with Dr. Elizabeth Ellie, who was studying the evolution of flowers. And as soon as you start to study flowers, you have to think about the bees. And so it kind of slid as she slid into thinking about pollinators, and I got into that project. I got really excited thinking about things that might affect bees. So not just bees in the flowers, but the predators or the pathogens that might change their populations or their interactions with the things that they eat. And that kind of is where it all started.
Nice. And so how long has it been?
Time. I graduated from my undergrad in 2005 or 6. So a few years.
So you're already doing research on bees for your undergrad?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yeah, I
That's
did work on some of that for a few years with Dr. Ellie. And it was kind of fun because then I did my PhD and then I came back and I did a postdoc with her before I came to UFV. So
that's awesome.
kind of full circle was nice.
Nice. And then I don't see any other questions, so I will ask the last question here. What do you hope your research would accomplish?
Oh, man. I really hope to get some answers about what's happening with populations of bees here in the Fraser Valley, because with the data I have now, I have these questions about why are there so many pathogens. I really hope to work with collaborators to document what's happening with Bombus impatiens and help inform policy around the movement of non-native bees around North America, because impatient was kind of brought here, and I don't think people thought about it too critically because it's a bee. Nothing wrong with bringing another bee, but then you have all of these native bees that they're interacting with, and it's certainly a concern. And then from a more applied side, I really want to work with farmers to come up with practical solutions to their issues with pollination, right? So I have all this sort of conservation stuff I do, but I also really enjoy applied research that's answering the questions that farmers actually have about, should I be concerned about pollination? Are bumblebees useful? How do I encourage bumblebees in my crops? So I like to do sort of that aspect of things as well.
Nice. And here's some more questions came up. So thanks for a very informative talk. What would you advise to blueberry growers like me to encourage native bumblebees over eastern bumblebees?
There's not much you can do about the eastern bumblebee because it will eat the same things that the native bumblebees do. So the best thing you can do is think about making your farm bee friendly for all bumblebees, right? So what that looks like, I have a student, we're going to work on some things this summer, coming summer, on nest boxes and some other stuff like that. So I might have more clear answers for you then, but keeping some bumblebee friendly plants along the edges of your fields, obviously following all of the advice you have from regulators on pesticide use and things like that would be the place that I would start. And then, yeah, I'll have some information hopefully by next fall on nest boxes and maybe some other things that growers could do if they want to bring in more wild bees to their farms.
And would it help you, your study, if we were to collect dead bumblebees for you? And we've noticed a lot dying on their property here.
Not really. So the thing is, I have to collect them and freeze them right away to be able to dissect them and get the information that I need. And, you know, if you found them dead, they might have dried up quite a while ago. And so, but what you could do if you're interested in contributing is that there are Bumblebee Watch programs. The program is called Bumblebee Watch. And I think it's an iNaturalist one. So if you know some basic ID, and a lot of these citizen science places websites have the basic ID information for you, you can put in a little bit of data on the bees that you're seeing on your property, which can help track the spread of the eastern bumblebee and the abundance of our native bees as well.
So this could be a sort of a citizen science project.
Yeah, it is a citizen science project.
Yeah.
I'm not involved in it, so I don't, yeah, but it's something that if you really want to help out that sort of research side of things, you can get the app on your phone and it does the GPS. It's pretty great. You can contribute to data sets that scientists use.
Is there any citizen science project that would be useful directly for your research?
Well, a project I might be involved in will use some of that data for sure. Yeah.
Okay. And then last question we have from Lucy Lee. Nausea bumblebee is one of many. Have you looked at other?
Yeah, so Nausea bumblebee is the microsporidium, the disease that's specific to bumblebees, but there's two that affect honeybees, Nausea apis and ceranae, and there's pretty good evidence, okay, there's definite evidence that they cross-infect bumblebees. I had a student do some preliminary research using molecular work to see if we were getting the honeybee microsporidians in the bumblebees. So that'd be another kind of spillover, but from honeybees to bumblebees instead. And we didn't see any evidence of that. It was a little bit preliminary. I'd like to look into that in more detail, but we don't really know yet.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This was a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Learned
these
a
are
lot.
great questions. Yeah, fantastic questions.
Oh yeah, it was good. It was very good. And I will just share some few more details for the next science talks.
All right, I will stop my video and let you.
And thanks again
you're
for your time and the presentation. And here, just a few last sort of housekeeping note here. So we have one last speaker for this series. Will be on December 7th. Will be Ivan Cohen from the Center for Public Safety and Criminal Justice Research. So I'm hoping to see most of you, all of you actually, and more at this event. And again, you can see on our website, you can access all the former presentations, and we've got them there. And we'd like to thank again our sponsors and partners, the University of the Fraser Valley, Connects, TEDx Abbotsford, and a little shout out for TEDx Abbotsford. I think they have their event coming up in 2 weeks. So if you haven't registered, feel free to do so. I'd like to thank the UofB alumni, the Abbotsford Community Foundation and Vision, and the City of Abbotsford for to make this possible. And finally, you can find us online and different social media. Feel free to look us up and to share it with your friends. All right, and I see, thanks Sandra to share. She's just sharing some of the links on the chat. And yeah, thank you everyone, and I'm looking forward to see you again in a month from now. Enjoy November. Bye bye.